The law beneath the desert sun. The desert at dusk breathes in silence. The horizon glows faintly gold. The distant mountains burn red for a moment before fading into deep blue shadow. The air smells of dust, sagebrush, and a kind of dry eternity that only the American Southwest seems to hold. Here, where time itself feels slower, one can almost imagine the past still lingering. Echoes of hoofbeats, wagon wheels, and voices carried by the wind. Among those echoes, faint but unforgettable, is the sound of something strange. The soft measured tread of padded feet, the low rumble of a creature not quite of this world. A camel walking across the Arizona sand. It sounds like a legend, or perhaps a mirage. But long before anyone thought to make a law forbidding camels from Arizona's streets, they were very real. They marched here loaded with supplies for the United States Army. They stood blinking in the desert light, strange and unbothered, while soldiers and settlers stared in disbelief. And years later, when the last of them had vanished into the endless sand, someone decided they'd had quite enough of camels on public roads. A law was written. A sentence precis so, camels shall be permitted on public streets or highways. It remains one of the most curious laws in American history, a relic of a forgotten chapter when the US military tried to conquer the desert with creatures from halfway across the world. The story behind it is one of ambition, confusion, and unintended legacy. It begins not in Arizona, but in Washington, D.C., in the middle of the 19th century, when the United States was still a young and restless country. The year was 1855. The American frontier was expanding at an astonishing pace. New territories, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, stretched far beyond the settled East, across deserts that were vast, dry, and hostile to traditional methods of travel. The army was responsible for exploring, mapping, and securing these lands, but progress was slow. Horses and mules, the backbone of military logistics, struggled to endure the arid heat. Reports poured in, describing endless marches where animals collapsed from thirst. Supply lines broke down. Expeditions turned back. Something had to change. Enter Jefferson Davis, then serving as Secretary of War under President Franklin Pierce. A man of ambition and vision, Davis was fascinated by engineering and innovation. He had read reports of camels being used successfully across North Africa and the Middle East. Beasts of burden that could travel for days without water, carry hundreds of pounds, and thrive in temperatures that would kill a horse. In his mind, the answer was clear. If camels could cross the Sahara, surely they could cross the American desert. Davis proposed to Congress a radical idea that the United States Army should import camels and establish a Camel Corps to operate in the southwestern territories. Some lawmakers laughed, others were intrigued. The proposal was eccentric, but not entirely foolish. After debate, Congress approved $30,000 for the experiment, a small fortune in those days. And so, in the spring of 1856, two Navy ships, the supply and the store ship fashion, set sail from the Mediterranean, carrying with them the strangest cargo the United States military had ever seen. More than 70 camels, purchased from Egypt, Turkey and North Africa, along with a handful of native handlers to teach American soldiers how to manage them. When the ships reached the port of Indianola, Texas, the spectacle was unforgettable. Crowds gathered along the shore to see the towering animals kneel and rise again, their long necks bobbing, their huge eyes unblinking in the sun. Children shrieked in delight. Farmers gawked. One reporter wrote that the town has been conquered by humps. From there, the camels were moved inland to Camp Verde, Texas, where the United States Camel Corps was officially born. At first, the soldiers had no idea what to do with them. The animals were strange and temperamental, prone to spitting, biting and bellowing at inopportune moments. Their smell alone, one lieutenant complained, was enough to disgrace the barracks. Yet their capabilities were undeniable. They could carry enormous loads, barrels of water, crates of ammunition, even disassembled wagons, across terrain that would have crippled mules. The experiment's leader, Lieutenant Edward Fitzgerald Beale, quickly saw their potential. He was a bold and capable officer, famous for his expeditions across the frontier. When ordered to survey a wagon route from Texas to California, he insisted on using the camels. It would be the ultimate test. And so, in the summer of 1857, Beale's caravan, soldiers, surveyors, wagons, and a herd of ungainly camels began its journey westward. Across deserts so vast they seemed endless, through canyons and over ridges that had no names, they pressed on. The men sweated and swore, but the camels seemed almost serene. They travelled tirelessly, sometimes going 40 miles in a day without needing a single drop of water. Beale wrote in his journal, "The camels are invaluable. They are the true ships of this desert." When they reached the Colorado River, the test was complete. The camels had succeeded beyond expectation. They had proven that the American desert was no match for them. Yet, despite their success, the experiment was doomed. Not because of the camels, but because of timing. The winds of civil conflict were beginning to stir. Within a few short years, the nation would be at war with itself, and there would be no patience for exotic projects or peacetime innovation. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, the Camel Corps was abandoned. Some of the animals were sold to private owners, others escaped into the wilderness. A few were captured by Confederate forces and reportedly used to haul supplies. But most simply vanished into the desert. For decades afterward, travelers swore they saw them. Solitary camels wandering through the heat haze long after the army had forgotten them. They became ghosts of a forgotten dream. And yet, in a strange twist of fate, their lingering presence would one day lead to a law. One meant not for soldiers or explorers, but for the townsfolk of Arizona, who found themselves sharing the road with the last remnants of an impossible experiment. The birth of the Camel Corps. The story of the Arizona Camel Law cannot be told without first understanding the strange brilliance and quiet failure of the United States Camel Corps, one of the most unusual military ventures in American history. After their arrival in Texas in the late 1850s, the Camels became a local sensation. Newspapers printed sketches of them towering over soldiers with captions that half celebrated and half mocked the Army's exotic experiment. Some called them the Egyptian cavalry. Others said they looked like monsters from Noah's Ark. But the truth was, the Army had no animals better suited to the landscape they were entering. The deserts of the American Southwest were fierce and wide, more like North Africa than anything in Europe or the East. The sun could bake a man within hours. Horses foamed and collapsed in the heat. Mules required water every day, and water was a luxury few expeditions could count on. The camels, however, seemed made for the place. They could travel for 6 or 7 days without water, eating thorny plants that no other creature could stomach. Their broad feet moved easily over sand where wagon wheels bogged down. They were so efficient that Lieutenant Edward Beale, leading the first major test of the Camel Corps, wrote home that they could move across this desert as if it were a meadow. He quickly grew fond of them, though the soldiers under him did not. To them, the camels were odd, unpleasant beasts. They smelled awful, they groaned like thunder, and they had tempers sharp as cactus spines. When angered, they would spit or kick, and a few men were knocked unconscious by a well-placed blow from a long, heavy leg. Still, Beale saw beyond the inconvenience. In 1857, he led the first camel expedition from Texas to California, cutting a new route across the Southwest, through what would become New Mexico and Arizona. The terrain was brutal. Mile after mile of blistering sand, salt flats, and jagged rock. The heat shimmered so fiercely that the world itself seemed to bend and tremble. But the camels pressed on. Where horses faltered, they thrived. They carried supplies, barrels of water, crates of food, survey equipment, without complaint. Soldiers rode behind them in disbelief as the strange caravan trudged through canyons, forded dry rivers, and climbed ridges that offered no shade. The animals even demonstrated their intelligence. When a soldier lost his way one evening, the camel he was leading refused to continue forward. Annoyed, the man pulled harder, until finally he realized the beast had stopped at the edge of a deep ravine, invisible in the twilight. The camel had saved his life. At night, Beale's men would camp among the rocks and watch the animals settle down in silence. folding their long legs beneath them, their dark eyes gleaming like coals in the firelight. The desert wind would whisper through the tents, and for a moment the scene must have looked more like Arabia than America. The expedition's success was undeniable. Beale reached the Colorado River in record time, having lost neither animal nor man to the desert's cruelty. His reports to Washington were enthusiastic. "The camels," he wrote, "are far superior to any beasts of burden now in use in this country for military purposes. Their endurance, docility, and ability to subsist on the barest of forage render them invaluable in the service." And yet the project was already teetering. The army, steeped in its own traditions, did not take kindly to change. Officers mocked the idea of Arabian beasts in the ranks of American soldiers. Cavalrymen, proud of their horses, despised the sight of the awkward humped animals. The camels frightened the horses so badly that no mixed caravan could travel in peace. Mules would bolt at their smell. It was, in short, a cultural mismatch. The camels had done everything asked of them, but they did not belong. Then came politics. Jefferson Davis, the architect of the experiment, resigned from the War Department and soon after became President of the Confederacy. His association with the Camel Corps tainted it in the eyes of the Union government. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, the project was quietly abandoned. The camels, suddenly without purpose, were scattered. Some were sold at auction to freight companies and private owners. Others were released into the wild. A few made their way to travelling circuses and fairs, where they became curiosities, relics of an absurd dream. But in the deserts of the Southwest, something strange happened. The camels adapted. Freed from human masters, they roamed the sand and scrub like they were back in Arabia. They drank from dry riverbeds after rainstorms, ate the tough creosote bushes, and survived the heat with effortless grace. Travelers began reporting sightings. At first, just one or two, then dozens. Prospectors, soldiers and ranchers all told the same story. Camels wandering across the desert, wild and proud, their shadows stretching long in the twilight. Some said they saw herds of them near the Colorado River. Others claimed to have heard their haunting cries echoing through canyons at night. And as the stories spread, so too did the legends. The most famous of them all was the tale of the Red Ghost. According to frontier accounts from the 1880s, a strange creature haunted the Arizona frontier. A massive red camel, terrifying in both size and manner, with something awful tied to its back. The first sighting came from a ranch near Eagle Creek. A woman left her cabin one morning to fetch water and was found trampled to death in the dust. Around her body were enormous hoofprints, far too large to be those of a horse or cow. Soon after, others claimed to see the beast. It moved silently through the desert, sometimes at night, sometimes in full daylight, and always alone. One prospector said it had a human skeleton strapped to its back, sun-bleached bones bound by weathered leather straps. Terrified witnesses fired at it, but the creature never fell. It vanished into the horizon as if swallowed by the sun. For years, the legend of the red ghost spread across Arizona. Some believed it was one of the old army camels gone feral. Others thought it a spirit or an omen. Newspapers printed wild reports, and children whispered about it by lamplight. Finally, in 1893, a rancher near Eagle Creek shot and killed a massive red camel. Strapped to its back were the remains of a saddle and fragments of what appeared to be human bones. The story was over, but the myth remained. By the turn of the century, the wild camels had all but disappeared. The last confirmed sighting came in 1941, when a motorist near Douglas, Arizona, claimed to have seen one crossing the road at sunset. He stopped his car and stared as the creature turned its head, looked directly at him, and then slipped away into the desert haze. Whether the account was true or not hardly mattered. By then, the camels had become ghosts of history. But even as they vanished, their memory lingered in an unexpected place: the law. As Arizona grew from territory to statehood, local officials began drafting ordinances to regulate life in its towns and cities. Among the rules about livestock, wagons and street traffic, there appeared a curious line: "No camels shall be permitted on public streets or highways." It was an echo of an era now gone, a time when camels were real enough to be a nuisance. And like many odd laws born from practical problems, it would outlive the problem itself by generations. The camels of the Wild West. By the late 1860s, the American Southwest was changing faster than anyone could have imagined. Railroads carved lines through the wilderness where once only wagon trails wound. Mining towns sprouted from dust like mirages, blooming with saloons, blacksmiths and half-built dreams. The Civil War was over, and the country's attention had turned westward again, toward expansion, opportunity, and the promise of fortune buried beneath the desert sand. But out among the mesas and dry riverbeds, far from the reach of the new towns, the camels still roamed. They had no masters now, no soldiers to command them, no wagons to pull, no loads to bear. They wandered through a land vast enough to forget them, and kind enough, in its brutal way, to let them live. Ranchers sometimes glimpsed them at dawn, moving in single file along the horizon. Prospectors returning from the mountains swore they'd heard their strange, guttural cries echoing across the desert. One miner in Arizona Territory wrote in his journal, "At first I thought it was thunder rolling over the hills, but the sky was clear. Then I saw it, a tall beast with two humps and a gait like no horse or mule. It stared at me a long while before moving on." The reports were so numerous that local newspapers began publishing them as curiosities. The Prescott Journal-Minor, in 1875, printed a short note. "Camel seen again near the Verde River. Old army stock, most likely. Frightened 3 mules and a boy." For most, the camels were nuisances. They startled livestock, trampled gardens, and scared travellers unaccustomed to such alien shapes emerging from the desert glare. A few were captured and displayed in circuses, touted as survivors of a government experiment gone wrong. But most remained elusive, half ghosts in the heat. And in a way, they became part of the West's mythology, like the outlaws, the gold seekers, and the mysterious lights said to flicker over the mountains at night. Yet, for all their strangeness, the camels also represented something deeply human: the ambition to conquer nature and the humility of failing to do so. The Camel Corps had been an idea of logic and reason, an attempt to solve a problem through innovation. But in the end, it was undone by pride and prejudice. The animals succeeded where people failed, but they were abandoned nonetheless. By the time Arizona reached territorial maturity in the late 1870s, few alive remembered that the army had ever imported camels. The new generation of settlers saw them only as wild intruders. And soon, local authorities began taking measures to regulate them, not as curiosities, but as hazards. One of the earliest recorded municipal ordinances mentioning camels dates to the town of Gila Bend, where local officials, irritated by the beasts wandering near water sources, declared that no camels shall be permitted to enter the township or the roads thereof. The reason, according to a later account, was simple. A single camel had disrupted a freight caravan by frightening the mules so badly that several wagons overturned. Other towns followed. In Yuma and Tucson, similar restrictions appeared, often grouped with rules about cattle, goats, and pigs. Most of these early laws have been lost or replaced over the decades, but their legacy endures in Arizona's modern code. A faint echo of those days when camels still walked the land. By the turn of the century, however, the camels themselves were almost gone. Only a few isolated sightings occurred between 1900 and 1920. One prospector near the Grand Canyon claimed he saw a light-colored camel drinking from a creek. Another report from 1927 told of a farmer near Quartzsite who awoke to find his melon patch trampled. The culprit, according to enormous hoofprints, was a beast not native to these parts. These stories soon drifted from fact to folklore. The wild camels became the stuff of campfire tales, blending with local legends like the Lost Dutchman's Mine and the desert spirits said to haunt the mountains at night. And through it all, the Arizona camel law remained, quiet, unchallenged and strangely poetic. A line of text in the state's legal history that seemed to whisper of a forgotten past. But while the law endured in the books, its spirit lived on in the people who retold its story. For the residents of Arizona, it became a symbol, not just of absurdity, but of identity. A reminder that the desert does not easily forget what passes through it. The law takes shape. The first codified version of the anti-camel ordinance appeared in the early 1900s, though its exact wording has varied. Legal historians believe it began as a municipal code regulating livestock and animal transport. In towns like Kingman, Prescott, and Tucson, officials sought to prevent large or unusual animals from wandering into public spaces, especially after incidents with escaped circus animals and privately owned camels. By this point, the camel population was negligible, but the idea of needing such a law had already taken root. It became something of a running joke among lawmakers, a nod to Arizona's eccentric past. Yet, like many laws born from bygone problems, it was never fully erased. The state's legislative archives still preserve mentions of it, buried within animal control codes, a faint trace of the 19th century's strangest experiment. And while the rule itself is largely symbolic today, it has a curious side effect. It keeps alive one of America's least known adventures: the time the United States Army imported camels to conquer the desert. Generations later, school children would read about the Camel Corps in textbooks, half believing it a myth. And some, upon hearing that camels were once banned from Arizona's streets, would laugh, not realizing that the absurdity hides a deeper truth. The law is the final footprint of an animal that once marched proudly across the American frontier, from practicality to folklore. As decades passed, the camel law faded into obscurity. Arizona became a state in 1912, and the world changed. Automobiles replaced horses, roads cut across deserts once thought impassable. The camels, long gone, became footnotes in dusty journals and yellowed newspapers. Yet every so often, the old stories resurfaced. A rancher swearing he'd seen something tall and brown moving along the ridge. A traveller claiming to hear low bellows in the night. In small towns like Quartzsite, these tales became part of local identity. In fact, Quartzsite itself holds a strange connection to the camels that few other places can claim. Near the town stands the grave of High Jolly, a man whose real name was Haji Ali, one of the original camel drivers brought over from the Middle East to train the US soldiers. When the Camel Corps disbanded, he stayed behind, eventually becoming a US citizen and living out his days in Arizona as a scout, miner, and beloved local character. When he passed away in 1902, the people of Quartzsite built him a pyramid-shaped tomb of stone and dedicated it to his memory, the only monument of its kind in the state. Atop it, they placed a bronze camel. The plaque reads, "High Jolly, born somewhere in Syria about 1828, Died at Quartzsite, December 16th, 1902. Came to this country February 10th, 1856. Camel driver, packer, scout, over 30 years, a faithful aide to the U.S. government. It is one of Arizona's quietest but most meaningful memorials. Not to conquest or victory, but to an experiment that bridged two worlds, and to the man who, in his own way, embodied the strange friendship between them. Today, visitors stop by the High Jolly Monument, unaware that not far from that stone pyramid, a law once forbade the very animals he loved from walking the streets. It is an irony he might have appreciated. The law that wouldn't end. Time has a peculiar way of preserving the strange. Long after the last camel's hoofprint was erased by wind and rain, the law forbidding them lingered, quiet, harmless, and mostly forgotten. By the early 20th century, Arizona was no longer the lawless frontier of dusty trails and wandering beasts. Cities were rising, Phoenix, Tucson, Prescott, and paved streets replaced wagon tracks. The automobile was reshaping every corner of daily life. Yet in the scrolls of municipal codes and territorial statutes, the old line remained. No camels shall be permitted on public streets or highways. It was a ghost in ink, a remnant of an age that had already faded into story. The reason it survived was simple. Nobody bothered to remove it. Laws once written have a strange inertia. They persist through oversight, through habit, through the quiet tendency of bureaucracy to leave well enough alone. And so, as Arizona modernized, its books filled with relics, old ordinances about watering troughs, about tying horses to lampposts, and about keeping pigs from wandering Main Street. Among them, the camel rule slumbered peacefully. For decades, no one paid it any mind. Then, in the mid-20th century, something unexpected happened. The world rediscovered its sense of humor about the past. Magazines and newspapers began publishing lists of strange but true laws. Oddities meant to amuse rather than instruct. In those columns, nestled between rules about frogs, donkeys, and dancing on Sundays, the Arizona camel law re-emerged. In Arizona, one writer quipped, it is illegal for camels to walk down Main Street. The line spread like wildfire, repeated and embellished until it became one of the most famous weird laws in the United States. Readers chuckled at its absurdity. How could anyone have thought such a rule necessary? Yet few realized it was not a joke at all, but a faint echo of real history, of an army's failed experiment, of beasts that once carried the hopes of empire across the sand. As interest in these curious laws grew, so too did the fascination with their origins. Folklorists and local historians began tracing them back, uncovering the stories behind each. Some laws, it turned out, were exaggerations or misunderstandings. Others were based on truth. And in the case of Arizona's camel ban, The evidence was solid. There had been camels here, real ones, official ones, government-issued ones. They had walked these deserts, frightened livestock, and stirred enough confusion that towns passed ordinances to keep them out. In a way, the law had never been absurd at all. It had simply outlived its context. But by then, context no longer mattered. The camel rule had entered the realm of legend. It was shared in classrooms, trivia nights, and even tourist brochures as a symbol of Arizona's eccentric charm. It was, people said, the most southwestern law imaginable. And yet, the deeper one looks, the more poetic it becomes. The law that once sought to banish camels from Arizona's roads is, in its own quiet way, the last monument to their presence. The stones marking High Jolly's grave may weather and fade, but the words in the legal code, a simple prohibition, continue to carry their memory forward. Echoes in the dust. Every desert holds its ghosts, and Arizona's are particularly persistent. The ghost towns crumble, but are never entirely gone. The wagon ruts fade, but remain visible from the air. And somewhere, hidden in the dry folds of old legal parchment, the camels still linger, not as beasts of burden, but as symbols of how the past clings to the present in unexpected ways. By the 1950s, stories of the Red Ghost were being retold on radio programs and in pulp magazines. Children listened wide-eyed as narrators described the haunting cry of a giant camel stalking the desert night. The facts were less important than the feeling, that Arizona was a place where the strange was not only possible, but expected. In this atmosphere, the camel law thrived. It became part of the state's identity, something mentioned in travel guides and trivia books, often alongside other oddities, like it being illegal to let a donkey sleep in a bathtub or to cut down a cactus without permission. Tourists loved these things. They gave Arizona character, a touch of whimsy beneath the relentless sun. But behind every law, even the funny ones, lies a fragment of truth. The Camel Ordinance was not born of whimsy. It came from the real friction of the Old West. Soldiers and settlers struggling to adapt, animals introduced into ecosystems they did not belong to, and a landscape that humbled every attempt to control it. If one listens carefully, the story becomes less about the absurdity of a rule and more about the persistence of memory, how laws, like fossils, capture the shape of something that once lived. The forgotten witnesses. In the quiet archives of Arizona's county courthouses, among faded ledgers and territorial records, small clues to the Camel Age still exist. Handwritten notations mention camel sightings and beasts causing disturbance. Old military correspondence preserved in Washington, D.C., still carries Jefferson Davis's careful signature. A man who believed that camels could tame the desert. One letter from 1858 records an officer's exasperation. The animals, though of great endurance, cause continual alarm among our horses. The men detest them. Another, written after the Civil War, laments the abandonment of the finest stock ever seen in service. It is in these quiet, bureaucratic traces that we find the seeds of the later law. Every ordinance, after all, begins with a complaint. Someone saw something, someone was troubled, someone put pen to paper, and the words became rule. By the time those words reached the dusty towns of early Arizona, their origin was already half forgotten. The locals who signed them into law had likely never seen a camel, only heard stories of them from old soldiers and travellers. To them, the beasts were just another hazard of the open range, like wolves or wild cattle, something best kept off the streets. And so the rule was written. It solved a problem that would never come again. The law in the modern age. As the 20th century advanced, the camel law quietly travelled with it. When Arizona updated its legal codes, the language about camels often remained, tucked away in broader sections about livestock or exotic animals. Even as the world changed, as highways stretched across the desert and cities sprawled across old caravan trails, the law endured. In a peculiar twist, modern interpretations of animal control occasionally revived it. When filmmakers in the 1970s and 80s brought camels into Arizona for desert scenes, some municipalities briefly revisited the old ordinances to issue special permits. It was perhaps the only time in living memory that the law had any practical relevance. Today, it survives mostly as a curiosity. But every time it is mentioned, in a travel article, a podcast, or a list of America's strangest laws, it keeps alive a story that might otherwise have been forgotten entirely. Because behind that single line of legal text lies a century of history, a vision of progress, an experiment with foreign animals, the laughter of skeptical soldiers, the tragedy of abandonment, and the enduring desert itself, patient, ancient, and vast enough to remember what people forget. Legacy of the camels. The Arizona desert has always had a long memory. Beneath its stillness, stories linger like bones under sand, waiting for wind or curiosity to uncover them again. The camels are gone. The soldiers who led them have long since faded from memory, yet their prints remain, not on the land, but in the laws, the legends, and the imagination of those who still tell their tale. Every generation finds the story again in a new form. A school teacher in the 1950s reads to her students about the Camel Corps. A hiker in the 1980s passes through Quartzsite and stops to photograph High Jolly's pyramid. A tourist scrolling through the internet in the 21st century laughs at a trivia list claiming it's illegal to let a camel walk down an Arizona street. Each of them, without realizing it, is taking part in the slow resurrection of history. The camels live on through words, the desert that remembered. If you stand today at sunset in the quiet places, the open flats beyond Yuma, or the low red hills near Quartzsite, and the light catches the sand just right, you might almost see what the first settlers saw. The horizon wavers, the air ripples, a shape forms in the shimmer, tall, deliberate, impossibly out of place. For a moment, imagination takes over. You can almost hear the sound of padded feet pressing softly into sand. You can almost believe that one of the old army camels has returned, trudging across the centuries. That is the strange gift of the Arizona desert. It hides nothing forever. Everything that once belonged to it returns in some way, through fossils, through memory, through stories whispered beside campfires. Even the most improbable things leave traces. And so, when someone mentions that it's against the law for camels to walk on Arizona streets, the desert smiles quietly, as if to say, "Of course it is. We remember why." High Jolly's Rest. Every year, travelers still visit the pyramid of stone that marks the resting place of High Jolly, the Syrian camel driver who brought those first beasts across the ocean and into this land of sage and sand. The monument stands modestly by the roadside, surrounded by desert silence and the hum of passing traffic. The bronze camel atop it catches the sunlight, its profile stark against the blue Arizona sky. People stop, read the plaque, take a photograph and move on. But for a moment they bridge the gap between worlds. They stand where an experiment once unfolded, where men dreamed of taming the desert and discovered instead how vast it truly was. High Jolly's grave is more than a memorial. It is the final punctuation of the Camel Corps story, and by extension, the living echo of that curious lore. Without him, without the camels he led, there would be no ordnance to laugh about, no myth of the red ghost, no symbol of Arizona's enduring eccentricity. The pyramid, like the law, endures not because it must, but because the desert prefers to keep its stories intact, from law to legend. By the late 20th century, historians began re-examining America's so-called absurd laws. What they discovered was that nearly every one of them had been born from practicality, only to become funny by accident long after their purpose disappeared. The camel law was a perfect example. It had begun as a measure of public safety, then drifted into legend. But unlike most forgotten statutes, it continued to inspire curiosity. Writers, filmmakers and local museums began weaving it into the broader tapestry of the West. It appeared in documentaries, in travel brochures, even in children's books about weird American history. Each retelling made the story softer, friendlier, a bedtime tale rather than a historical footnote. And somewhere along that line, the law ceased to be about camels entirely. It became about us, about the way humans cling to the improbable, finding meaning and humor in the relics of our own imagination. After all, what is a law without those who remember it? What is history without someone to smile at its strangeness? Echoes of a vanished caravan. If one could gather all the moments the camels passed through, the first arrival on the Texas coast, the long march westward, the soldiers' laughter, the ghost stories, the municipal ordinances, and listen to them as a single piece of music, it would sound something like the desert wind at dusk. Slow, mournful, and eternal. The wind doesn't ask why. It simply moves over the land, carrying fragments of memory like sand grains. A bone here, a rumour there, a line in a law book that no one quite understands anymore. Together they form the melody of place. That melody hums beneath every odd law we inherit. It hums in the sentence forbidding camels on Arizona's streets. It hums in the laughter of those who hear it and wonder who would ever need such a rule. The answer, of course, is that once upon a time someone did. The meaning that remains. In the end, the absurdity of the camel law is not a joke at all. It is a testament to history's persistence. It reminds us that even the most fleeting human experiments leave footprints. It reminds us that imagination and practicality are never far apart, that what begins as innovation may one day survive only as laughter. And above all, it reminds us that the desert remembers everything. The camels may be gone, the soldiers long buried, but the spirit of their story still walks. Not on the streets they were banned from, but through the minds of those who listen. So the next time someone tells you it's illegal for a camel to walk down an Arizona road, you can smile and know that behind the humor lies a tale of endurance, vision, and the quiet poetry of time. Because somewhere in the endless sunlit silence beyond the highways, the desert is still holding its breath, waiting for the sound of padded feet returning home.